Wait. He said what? War is not travel, and troops are not tourists. Well, that does sort of make sense, but yeah, it shouldn't be his call, right? Or, yeah, okay. Yeah, let me know what happens. See ya. July 22nd, 1951. The Chinese volunteer army that has led the communist fight in Korea since last fall are in reality not volunteers. They had some successes, for sure, but the last few months have failed in their offensives, and failed badly, taking massive casualties and being pushed back ever northward. But you know what they have gained? And to them, it is very much worth the cost? Prestige. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the big news was the beginning of ceasefire negotiations in Kaesong, though not a whole lot had been accomplished by the end of the week. But those talks continue all this week long. The negotiations are taking more time than they might in other situations because of the language barrier. Whatever communist spokesman Neidell says must be translated into Chinese and English. Everything UN spokesman Turner Joy says into Korean and Chinese. But okay, small progress is being made. For example, they insist that the 38th parallel must be the new line of demarcation, although the UN armies in most places stood well above it, and the parallel, as had been proved, was hardly a defensible line. However, on the 16th, they, the Chinese and North Koreans, agree to stop specifically mentioning the 38th parallel, but will instead use the phrase, establishment of a military demarcation line between both sides to establish a demilitarized zone as a basic condition for a ceasefire. Dean Rusk, who, as we've seen, is working Far Eastern affairs at the U.S. State Department, relays such things to Allied ambassadors, and he says that the communists see these talks as a permanent peace settlement, especially with consideration to the removal of foreign troops from Korea. But he himself thinks that that's not really a topic for purely military armistice negotiations. What does foreign troops mean anyhow? First, the Chinese and North Koreans try to get them defined as those troops sent to Korea under instructions of their government. The UN will never accept that, though, since the Chinese still claim all their forces in Korea are volunteers. And how about not Korean and not in the Korean army then? Rusk has an issue with this, thinking Chinese soldiers might somehow get around this and into the KPA, the North Korean army. He tells the ambassadors the 18th that they'll keep working on the language, but there's a monkey wrench thrown in on the 19th. Neidell says, war is not travel and troops are not tourists. Should the ceasefire be ordered and armistice achieved, and the foreign armed forces still stay where they are, it is clear that the intention is not to let them enjoy the scenic beauties of Korea. Well, how do you interpret that? The UN delegates think this is just trying to create political pressure to accept the recent definitions of foreign soldiers. The UN Forces commander, Matt Ridgway, is trying to eliminate talk in the press about the boys coming back home. But Ridgway could not dampen press speculation that an armistice was at hand. The State Department asked Allied ambassadors for forbearance. The United States did not want to be pressured in yielding on substantive issues, as the communists clearly were pressing it to do. If the United States decided to break off negotiations on the troop withdrawal issue, the public must be prepared for such a contingency. However, the United States did not intend to get into a propaganda war with the communists. Any public statements would come from Ridgway, not officials in Washington and elsewhere. There's something else bugging Ridgway this week as well. While these talks are going on, the Chinese are massively reinforcing in Korea, like right now. Intelligence suggests the communist forces in Korea this week are nearly 500,000 men in 71 divisions and 3 brigades. And if that's so, then they're bringing in 600 tons a day more supplies than those troops would normally need daily. Based on what intelligence has seen in the past, they bring in enough stuff to sustain a 71 division attack 4 to 7 days, or a 45 division attack 9 to 11 days. So Ridgway and others think the Chinese may draw the talks out as long as possible to build up during the lull for a big offensive before the summer ends. 2 things with Ridgway then. Today, the 21st, he tells the Joint Chiefs he wants to launch an all-out airstrike on Pyongyang after dropping leaflets in advance to warn the locals to achieve a devastating blow on all the supplies and everything built up in the area. This would hopefully stop the enemy's stubborn tactics in the negotiations too. U.S. President Harry Truman agrees with the Joint Chiefs that the wisdom of such a strike is questionable at this time, and it is canceled. However, yesterday, the 20th, Ridgway tells the Joint Chiefs that he's telling Admiral Joy to tell the enemy that unless they drop their demand for withdrawal of foreign troops, the UN will break off talks for the time being. Ridgway sets a deadline of 7 a.m. today, feeling rather strongly the enemy won't want to break off talks over this. The Joint Chiefs bring this to state, but because of the time difference and all, they hear it 2 hours before the deadline. Rusk is aghast. They can't do this. It might be a challenge to communist prestige on an order large enough they won't consider conceding and will break off talks for good. And hey, the public might think the communists are making major concessions if they accept, and that's not good if they're not. Well, today, state, defense, and Truman's views are all sent in a cable, which does give Ridgway backing on the troop removal issue, but also warns him that it may well be a breaking point. But if there should be a breaking point, they really want it to rest on communist shoulders. They do say, how about a new strategy where the communists can air their thoughts about troop withdrawals as they like without the UN having to make an agreement to accept them? This is confusing, is it not? Well, here's the upshot as the week comes to its end. The communists agreed to drop their insistence on troop withdrawal from the agenda in return for assurance that the subject would be discussed at governmental level after the armistice. Thus, the fifth agenda item became wondrously broadly worded, recommendations to the governments of the countries concerned on both sides. Agreeing on the agenda had consumed 10 full meetings of the delegations, plus innumerable staff sessions. It's taking time, that is for sure. The tragedy of the talks was that the communists intended merely to transfer the war from the battlefield, where they were losing, to the conference table, where they might yet win something. The United Nations' desire for peace was genuine, almost frantic. Nothing else could have kept their negotiators subjected to harassment, stinging insult, and interminable delay at the green table after the first few sessions. What is the U.S. fighting for at this point? The Chinese have been contained, and at great cost to them too. But since the UN is willing to make an armistice and willing to have a demarcation line and not total victory, and the existence of the Republic of Korea has been saved, what is the gain in further fighting? Something to ponder. What have the Chinese gained, or the communist world in general? The communist world had gained no wealth, territory, or peoples, but by opposing American arms, by defying the United Nations with some success, Red China had undoubtedly neared great power status. Her prestige among Asian peoples, still smarting from Western humiliations, was enhanced, whatever moral questions were involved. A nation that had been continually harassed and humiliated by all powers since 1840 had actually defied the world and fought it to a standstill. It was this Asian feeling of solidarity with China that Americans found so hard to understand. That book goes on to quote a Captain Wei, who is on Taiwan with the Chinese Nationalist Army. He had a bit to say on the subject earlier this year. We listened to the radio, and the communists were defeating the Americans. Most of us had fought the communists all our adult lives. In a world the communists won, there could be no place for any of us or our families. It was very bad for us to have the communists win, but we had very queer feelings listening to the news of disaster in Korea. It was almost like a certain exaltation. For our colonel, who hated communists with all his soul, kept saying, "The Americans are being beaten by Chinese. The Americans are being beaten by Chinese." So this is what communist China wants to exploit. If China could fight off the UN forces, hold them at bay, then China would gain huge prestige in Asia. And a little sidetrack here about some of those UN forces. I've mentioned the possibility of it happening before, but in a couple of weeks, the British Commonwealth Forces will have been formed into a Commonwealth division. More on this next week when it looks like it will all be official. But what have they been doing lately? During the run-up to the formation of the 1st Commonwealth Division in July, the separate brigades continued to pursue their operational instructions. And once the line of the Imjin had been secured, digging began in earnest on the Kansas line positions. At the same time, patrols were sent out across the river in an attempt to locate and identify the enemy to the front of 1st Corps. These efforts proved of little value, as it was clear the Chinese had withdrawn well back from the Imjin and were eager to avoid contact. Okay, that's all well and good, but what about the Koreans living out there in the sort of no man's land between the two sides? Most of their country's infrastructure has been destroyed in the past year, and they damn sure don't want to be involved. And the best way to do that is to not offend either of the sides involved. So during the day, when the UN forces are out patrolling, they have signs and placards welcoming them. And at night, when the Chinese emerge from their hidden positions, they wave red flags. Well, until now. In July, the villages were cleared of their inhabitants, who were removed to safer areas in the rear of the Allied front. For several days, columns of British trucks were engaged in the thankless task of removing hundreds of distraught peasants and their animals from their ancestral homes, which soon became derelict and the fields overgrown. A new phase of the war had begun with this clearance of the population from the next battlefield. A new era has also begun with Ned Almond replaced as commander of U.S. 10th Corps, which happened at the end of last week. Clovis Byers has taken over command. Byers was chief of staff for U.S. 8th Army in World War II in the Southwest Pacific area. Also during the occupation of Japan until January 1948. He saw action in the war in Papua New Guinea. He was wounded there by a Japanese sniper. He won the Distinguished Service Cross, a Silver Star, and a Purple Heart. Later in the Philippines campaign, he earned a Bronze Star and oak leaf clusters for both Silver and Bronze Stars and more. After Japan, he was back in the States commanding the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, and then was Deputy Assistant Army Chief of Staff, G1, which is personnel. I also said last week that within 10th Corps, U.S. 2nd Division has replaced 1st Division in the front lines. This week and next, most of 1st Marine Division goes into the Corps Reserve. Not the 5th Marines, though. They stay near Indy as a ready reserve. Here's something interesting that also happened this week in Korea on Chodo Island from a mission that began last week. A contingent of the 6004th Air Intelligence Service Squadron terminates a mission that began in an effort to disassemble components of a downed MiG-15. The crashed aircraft contained many parts that help the U.S. unlock its secrets. The detachment is provided with protection while the operation is in progress. The mission succeeds in salvaging the parts, the most ever from a captured MiG. And that brings me to the end of the week, with some back and forth at Kaesong, and some progress being made there, although made at a snail's pace. T.R. Fehrenbach writes, from the American and UN point of view, the sole purpose of the meetings at Kaesong was to end the bloodshed and to create some sort of machinery to supervise such an armistice. This done, an entirely separate body would sift the political and territorial questions posed by the Korean situation in an atmosphere of peace. Americans, even the knowledgeable Dean Acheson, had once again tried to separate peace and war into neat compartments, to their sorrow. We here at Time Ghost separate peace and war into several channels. And in addition to this, we have the War to War series on the Time Ghost History channel, the Sedan miniseries on the World War II channel for you to go and check out. Everything that we make is courtesy of the Time Ghost Army. You too can join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Dale Bay is the Army Member of the Week for this channel, and these are the newest commissioned officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.